David was the kind of person who liked to keep things simple. He came to work every day, did his job well, and went home without causing any trouble. At 26 years old, he had been working at the same marketing company for 3 years. It was a good job in a tall building downtown, and he was grateful for it. The office was like many others. There were the big bosses who made all the important decisions. Then there were the middle managers who handled the daily work. And finally, there were people like David who did the research and wrote the reports. Everyone knew their place, and things ran smoothly most of the time. David's desk was in the corner by the window, which he actually liked. He could see the city streets below and watch people walking by during his lunch break. His work involved looking at numbers, making charts, and figuring out what products people wanted to buy. It wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but it paid the bills and gave him a sense of purpose. The company had offices in different countries, and sometimes people would transfer from one location to another. That's how everything started. To change for David, one Monday morning, their boss announced that someone new would be joining their team. Her name was Victoria, and she was coming from the London office. To be their new senior vice president. Victoria was different from anyone David had ever worked with. She was 42 years old, and when she walked into a room, everyone noticed. She had this way of speaking that made people listen, even when she was talking about boring business stuff. She wore expensive clothes and always looked perfect, like she had stepped out of a magazine. During her first week, Victoria held meetings with different teams to understand how things worked. David was nervous when it was his turn to present his recent project. He had spent weeks working on a report about customer preferences, and he wanted to make a good impression. The conference room was full that day. All the important people were there, sitting around the big table. David stood at the front with his laptop, clicking through slides and explaining his findings. He tried to speak clearly and not rush through his words, even though his heart was beating fast. As he talked about the data he had collected, David noticed something strange. Victoria was staring at him, not in a normal way, like when someone is paying attention to a presentation. This was different. Her eyes seemed to follow his every movement, and she had this small smile on her face that made him feel uncomfortable. When David finished his presentation, most people asked a few questions and then started packing up their things. But Victoria stayed in her seat. She waited until almost everyone had left the room before she stood up and walked over to him. "That was excellent work," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "I can see why your previous reports have been so well received." David felt a mix of pride and nervousness. Getting praise from someone so important was good for his career, but something about the way she said it made him feel uneasy. "Thank you," he replied, trying to sound professional. "I really enjoyed working on this project." Victoria stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Then she did something that surprised him. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a quick pat or a brief touch. Her hand stayed there, and she squeezed his shoulder gently while she continued talking. "I think we're going to work very well together," she said, her eyes looking directly into his. "I have a feeling you're going to be very important to our team's success." David didn't know what to say. He could feel the warmth of her hand through his shirt, and he noticed that her touch lingered longer than it should have. He glanced around the room and saw that a few of his coworkers were still there, gathering their papers and closing their laptops. They were trying not to look, but he could tell they had noticed what was happening. "I hope so," David managed to say, taking a small step back. Victoria's hand fell away from his shoulder, but she didn't seem bothered by his movement. "I'm sure of it," she said with that same smile. "I'll be keeping a close eye on your work." After Victoria left the room, David stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. His coworker Jake came over and started talking about the presentation, but David could tell that Jake had seen the interaction with Victoria. There was something in Jake's expression that suggested he found it as strange as David did. Over the next few days, David found himself thinking about that moment more than he wanted to. He told himself that he was probably reading too much into it. Maybe Victoria was just being friendly. Maybe that's how people acted in the London office. Maybe he was making a big deal out of nothing. But deep down, David knew that something was different about the way Victoria had looked at him and touched him. It wasn't the kind of professional interaction he was used to. It felt personal in a way that made him uncomfortable. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something he wasn't prepared for. The next week, David would learn that his instincts were right. Victoria's attention wasn't going to be a one-time thing. In fact, it was going to become a much bigger part of his daily life than he ever could have imagined. The weeks that followed were like walking through a maze where David never knew what was waiting around the next corner. Victoria's behavior became something he had to think about every single day. It wasn't just one strange moment anymore. It was becoming a pattern that made his stomach twist with worry. Every Tuesday, their department had team meetings in the main conference room. David used to look forward to these meetings because it meant he could share his progress and hear what everyone else is working on. But now, these meetings made him nervous. Victoria had started doing something that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. She would walk around the table while people were talking, which wasn't unusual for a boss. But when she got to David's chair, she would stop. She would stand right behind him and put both hands on his shoulders. At first, David thought maybe she was just being encouraging, like a coach supporting a player. But it wasn't like that at all. Her hands would rest there for minutes at a time while she talked about business goals and project deadlines. David could feel her fingers moving slightly, almost like she was giving him a massage. He would try to sit up straight and focus on what she was saying, but all he could think about was how everyone else in the room was watching. His coworker Jake would look down at his notebook. Lisa from accounting would stare at her computer screen. Even their department manager, Robert, would find something very interesting to look at on the wall. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with David when Victoria was standing behind him like that. The worst part was that Victoria would lean down to speak to him during these meetings. She would bend over so her face was close to his ear, and she would whisper things about the reports he was working on. Her voice was soft and low, and sometimes other people in the room would stop talking because they couldn't hear what she was saying. "I really like the way you analyze those customer surveys," she would whisper, her breath warm against his ear. "You have such a good understanding of what people want." David would nod and try to respond professionally, but his voice would come out quieter than usual. He felt like everyone was watching him, wondering what was being said, and judging him for the special attention he was getting. Outside of meetings, Victoria started finding reasons to visit David's desk. She would walk over with a file or a document, but instead of just handing it to him, she would lean over his shoulder to look at his computer screen. She would point at things on his monitor, and her arm would brush against his back. Sometimes, she would rest her hand on his shoulder while she talked, and David would count the seconds until she moved it away. His desk was in the corner, which used to be nice because it was quiet and private. Now it felt like a trap. When Victoria came over, other people in the office would glance over and then quickly look away. David started to feel like he was on display, like everyone was watching a show that he didn't want to be part of. The strangest thing was how Victoria always made it seem like she was just being a good boss. She would praise his work and tell him how valuable he was to the team. She would ask his opinion on important projects and include him in meetings with clients. If someone had only heard her words, they would think she was being professional and supportive. But David knew better. There was something in her tone, something in the way she looked at him, that made it clear this wasn't just about work. When she complimented his tie or told him he looked professional, she would let her eyes linger on him in a way that made him uncomfortable. David started arriving at work earlier and leaving later, hoping to avoid running into Victoria in the elevator or the break room, but it didn't help. She seemed to always know where he was and when he would be there. Sometimes he would think he was safe, working quietly at his desk, and then he would hear her heels clicking on the floor behind him. The other people in the office began treating David differently too. Some of his coworkers started acting strange around him. They would stop talking when he joined their conversations, or they would make comments about how he was moving up in the world, or making important connections. These comments made David feel even worse because he knew they were talking about Victoria's behavior. A few people seemed sorry for him. His friend Jake would sometimes give him sympathetic looks, and Lisa would try to include him in normal conversations about weekend plans or TV shows. But even their kindness felt awkward, because nobody wanted to talk about what was really happening. David tried to figure out what to do. He thought about talking to Robert, his direct supervisor, but Robert seemed to be avoiding the whole situation. Whenever Victoria was around David, Robert would find something else to focus on. It was like he didn't want to see what was happening, because then he might have to do something about it. The worst part was that David started to doubt himself. Victoria was successful and respected in the company. She had been promoted several times and had brought in millions of dollars in new business. Maybe he was being too sensitive. Maybe this was just how things worked in the corporate world. Maybe he should feel lucky that someone so important was paying attention to him. But late at night, when David was trying to fall asleep, he knew that what was happening wasn't right. He knew that the way Victoria touched him and spoke to him wasn't professional. He knew that the looks his coworkers gave him weren't about jealousy or career advancement. They were about something much more uncomfortable, something that nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everyone could see as the days passed. David realized that this situation wasn't going to resolve itself. Victoria's behavior was getting bolder, and his discomfort was growing stronger. Something was going to have to change. But David had no idea what that would be or how it would happen. The company's annual dinner was supposed to be a celebration every year. They rented out a fancy hotel ballroom downtown and invited all the employees, their families, and important clients. It was a chance for everyone to dress up, eat good food, and forget about work for one evening. David had been looking forward to it for weeks, thinking it would be a break from the uncomfortable situation at the office. He bought a new suit for the occasion and even got his hair cut. The event was formal, and he wanted to look professional. More importantly, he hoped that in such a public setting, with so many people around, Victoria would have to behave normally. Surely she wouldn't act inappropriately in front of clients and other important people from the company. The hotel ballroom was beautiful, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and round tables covered in white tablecloths. There were flowers everywhere, and a live band was playing soft music in the corner. David felt good as he walked in, greeting his co-workers and their families. For the first time in months, he felt relaxed. During the cocktail or before dinner, David found himself standing with a group of his co-workers near the bar. They were talking about a recent project, and David was actually enjoying himself. Jake was there, along with Lisa from accounting and a few other people from different departments. Everyone was dressed up and in good spirits. David had his phone out, showing the group some charts from a customer satisfaction survey he had been working on. It was the kind of normal, professional conversation he used to have all the time before Victoria arrived. He was pointing at the screen, explaining what the numbers meant when he felt someone approach from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Victoria. He could smell her perfume, the same expensive scent she wore every day. But this time, instead of just putting her hand on his shoulder like she did in meetings, she did something that made everyone in the group stop talking. Victoria stepped directly behind David, so close that he could feel her body against his back. Then she reached around him from both sides, like she was giving him a hug from behind. Her arms came around his chest, and she rested her hands on his phone, pretending to look at the screen he was showing the group. David felt his face turn red. He could hear his heart beating in his ears. Victoria was pressed against him completely, and her arms were wrapped around him like they were in a relationship. He could feel her breathing on his neck as she spoke to the group about the project. David has done such incredible work on this analysis, she said, her voice carrying that same tone she used in the office. He really understands what our customers are thinking. The group of co-workers stood there in stunned silence. Lisa looked down at her drink. Jake stared at something across the room. Nobody knew what to say or where to look. David wanted to step away, but Victoria's arms were holding him in place. What made it worse was that Victoria wasn't acting like anything unusual was happening. She continued talking about the business implications of David's research, all while maintaining her grip around his chest. Her hands moved slightly as she gestured, and David could feel every movement. "We should definitely use these insights for our next campaign," Victoria continued, her voice right next to David's ear. "David, you need to present this to the board next week." David managed to nod, but he couldn't find his voice. He was aware that other people in the ballroom were starting to notice what was happening. He could see other groups of employees glancing over, and some of them were whispering to each other. The moment felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Victoria released her hold on David and stepped back. She smoothed down her dress and smiled at the group like nothing had happened. "Well, I should go mingle with our clients," she said cheerfully. "David, excellent work as always." After she walked away, the group stood there in uncomfortable silence. David felt like he couldn't breathe properly. His shirt was wrinkled where Victoria had been pressed against him, and he could still feel the warmth of her arms around his chest. Jake was the first to speak. "So, should we go find our table for dinner?" he said, clearly trying to change the subject. Everyone agreed quickly, grateful for an excuse to break up the group and move away from what had just happened. But as they walked toward the dining area, David could see people staring at him. Word was spreading through the party about what they had witnessed during dinner. David sat at a table with his co-workers, but the conversation was strained. People kept glancing at him and then looking away. He could tell that everyone was thinking about what had happened during cocktail hour, but nobody wanted to talk about it. From across the room, David could see Victoria at the head table with the senior executives and important clients. She was laughing and talking animatedly, looking completely comfortable and confident. It was like the incident had never happened, at least for her. But for David, everything had changed. What Victoria had done wasn't just inappropriate behavior that he could ignore or rationalize away. It was a public display that had been witnessed by dozens of people, including clients and senior management, yet nobody had said anything. Nobody had stepped in to stop it. As David sat there picking at his dinner, he realized something that made his stomach turn. Victoria's behavior wasn't just about making him uncomfortable. It was about showing everyone in the company that she could do whatever she wanted, and no one would dare to challenge her. The message was clear. David belonged to her, and she could touch him however she wanted, whenever she wanted, even in front of a room full of people. And the silence of everyone who witnessed it told him that he was completely alone in this situation. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. David left the party early, claiming he had a headache. But as he drove home, he knew that his headache was the least of his problems. Tomorrow, he would have to face everyone who had seen what happened, and he would have to figure out how to deal with the situation that was spiraling completely out of his control. The Monday after the company dinner was one of the worst days of David's life. He had spent the entire weekend thinking about what had happened, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He had considered calling in sick, but he knew that would only make things worse, so he got dressed, drove to work, and tried to pretend that everything was normal. But everything was not normal. From the moment David walked into the office, he could feel the change in the air. People were looking at him differently. Some of his coworkers would start whispering when they saw him coming, then stop talking when he got close enough to hear. Others would give him sympathetic looks, like he was sick or had suffered some kind of loss. Jake tried to act normal, but even he seemed uncomfortable. During their usual morning coffee break, Jake kept the conversation focused on safe topics like the weather and sports. He didn't mention the company dinner, and David was grateful for that. But the elephant in the room was so big that their conversation felt forced and awkward. Lisa from accounting was different too. She had always been friendly with David, often stopping by his desk to chat about weekend plans or funny stories from her kids. Now she barely made eye contact with him. When she did have to interact with him for work purposes, She was polite, but distant, like she was afraid of getting too close to whatever was happening between him and Victoria. The worst part was the comments. David started hearing whispers and jokes that made his stomach turn. People would make remarks about how he was moving up fast or getting special treatment. Someone left a note on his desk that said, "Looks like you found the secret to success." These comments felt like knives because they suggested that David was somehow benefiting from Victoria's behavior, or worse, that he was encouraging it. David's work performance began to suffer. He found it hard to concentrate on his reports and analysis. He would sit at his computer, staring at spreadsheets, but his mind would wander to thoughts about Victoria and what she might do next. He started making small mistakes in his calculations, and his usually detailed reports became sloppy and incomplete. Sleep became impossible. David would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the situation. He would imagine different scenarios where he could confront Victoria or report her behavior. But every imaginary conversation ended badly. She was too important, too connected, and too skilled at making her actions seem innocent. The breaking point came when David decided to speak with someone in human resources. He had been putting it off for weeks, but he finally realized that he couldn't handle the situation alone. He needed help. And HR was supposed to be there to protect employees from exactly this kind of problem. The HR office was on the 3rd floor, and David felt nervous as he walked up the stairs. He had rehearsed what he was going to say, trying to find the right words to explain what was happening, without sounding like he was complaining or being dramatic. The HR representative was a woman named Patricia who had been with the company for over 10 years. She was known for being fair and professional, and David hoped she would understand his situation. He sat across from her desk and tried to explain everything that had been happening. "I'm having some issues with my supervisor," David began, his voice shaking slightly. "There have been some interactions that have made me uncomfortable, and I'm not sure how to handle them." Patricia listened patiently as David described Victoria's behavior. He told her about the shoulder touches during meetings, the way Victoria would lean over him at his desk, and finally, the incident at the company dinner. He tried to be specific and factual, avoiding emotional language that might make him seem unreliable. When David finished speaking, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him a series of questions that made his heart sink. Did Victoria ever explicitly say anything inappropriate? Had she made any direct advances? Were there any witnesses who would be willing to make statements about what they had seen? David realized that his answers to these questions were not going to help his case. Victoria had never said anything that could be considered obviously inappropriate. Her behavior was always framed within the context of work discussions. And while many people had witnessed her actions, David doubted that any of them would be willing to speak up against someone so powerful in the company. "I understand that you're feeling uncomfortable," Patricia said finally, "but what you're describing could be interpreted as normal professional mentoring. Victoria is known for being very hands-on with her team members. She's also brought in more revenue than any other executive in the past 2 years." David felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Patricia was essentially telling him that his discomfort didn't matter, because Victoria was too valuable to the company. She suggested that David might be misreading the situation and advised him to maintain clear professional boundaries. "Maybe you could try speaking with Victoria directly," Patricia suggested. "Let her know if you prefer less physical contact during your interactions. Sometimes people aren't aware that their behavior is making others uncomfortable." David left the HR office feeling worse than when he had arrived. The conversation had made it clear that the company was not going to protect him from Victoria's behavior. In fact, they seemed to be suggesting that the problem was his perception, not her actions. Over the following weeks, David began to realize that he was trapped in a system that valued Victoria's contributions more than his comfort or well-being. Other employees continued to treat him strangely, and Victoria's behavior didn't change at all. If anything, she seemed more confident, as if she knew that no one would challenge her. David started to understand that his options were limited. He could continue to endure the situation and hope that it would eventually stop, or he could find a way to remove himself from Victoria's influence. Neither choice felt fair, but David was beginning to realize that fairness wasn't part of the equation. The company had made its priorities clear, and David's well-being was not at the top of the list. This realization was painful, but it was also the beginning of something important. For the first time since this whole situation had started, David began to think about what he could do to take control of his own life, rather than waiting for someone else to fix the problem for him. The moment that changed everything for David happened during what should have been a routine client presentation. It was a Thursday morning, and David was supposed to present his quarterly analysis to a group of important clients who were considering a major contract with the company. This was the kind of presentation that could make or break business relationships, and David had spent weeks preparing for it. The conference room was full of people in expensive suits. There were clients from 3 different companies, along with several senior executives from David's firm. David had his laptop ready. His slides were perfect, and he felt confident about his material. For a few minutes, he thought this might be the normal, professional interaction he had been craving. But then Victoria entered the room. She apologized for being late and took a seat at the back of the room. David felt his stomach tighten, but he tried to focus on his presentation. He began explaining his research findings, clicking through slides, and speaking clearly about customer trends and market analysis. Everything was going well until Victoria stood up. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, walking toward the front of the room. "But I think our clients should know that David is one of our most talented researchers. His insights have been absolutely crucial to our recent success." David felt a familiar dread as Victoria approached him. The clients were smiling and nodding, clearly impressed by the praise. But David knew that this wasn't just about professional recognition. Victoria positioned herself directly behind David, just as she had done at the company dinner. But this time, she went further. As David tried to continue his presentation, Victoria placed both hands on his shoulders and began to massage them gently. "David works so hard," she said to the clients, her hands moving on his shoulders. "Sometimes I have to remind him to relax a little." David's voice caught in his throat. He could feel his face turning red as Victoria's hands continued to move on his shoulders and neck. The clients were watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to clear discomfort. One of them, an older man in a gray suit, actually frowned and looked away. "As you can see from David's analysis," Victoria continued, seemingly oblivious to the awkwardness she was creating, "our customer satisfaction rates have improved significantly." Her hands moved to his upper arms, squeezing gently as she spoke. David tried to keep talking about his research, but his voice was shaking. He clicked to the next slide, but he couldn't focus on what he was saying. All he could think about was the fact that Victoria was touching him inappropriately in front of clients, and that this behavior was potentially damaging the company's reputation. The presentation ended quickly after that. The clients asked only a few brief questions, and David could tell that they were more focused on what they had witnessed than on his actual research. As people filed out of the room, David heard one of the clients whispering to another about unprofessional behavior. That evening, David sat in his apartment and realized that he had reached a breaking point. Victoria's behavior wasn't just affecting him anymore. It was affecting the company's business relationships. He had watched potential clients become uncomfortable and distracted during what should have been a crucial presentation. This wasn't just about his personal discomfort anymore. David made a decision that would change his life. Instead of continuing to hope that someone else would solve his problem, he decided to take control of his own situation. He spent the night writing down everything that had happened, creating a detailed record of every inappropriate interaction with Victoria. The next morning, David called in sick to work, but instead of staying home, he drove to a law office downtown. He had found the contact information for an employment attorney who specialized in workplace harassment cases, and he had made an appointment to discuss the situation. The attorney, a professional woman about his own age, listened carefully as David explained what had been happening. She asked detailed questions about each incident, and she seemed to understand the difficulty of his situation. Unlike the HR representative, she didn't suggest that David was misunderstanding Victoria's behavior. "What you're describing is clearly inappropriate," the attorney said. "The fact that it's happening in front of other people, including clients, makes it even more serious. You have the right to work in an environment where you're not subjected to unwanted physical contact." The attorney explained David's options. He could file a formal complaint with the company, but given their previous response, that might not be effective. He could also file a complaint with the state labor department, or he could consider legal action if the behavior continued. But the attorney also gave David some practical advice that proved to be the most valuable part of their conversation. She suggested that David might want to consider looking for a new job, not because he was giving up, but because sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to remove yourself from the situation, while ensuring that your experience is properly documented. "You can't control Victoria's behavior," the attorney said, "but you can control your own career and your own future. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to choose a better situation for yourself." David left the attorney's office, feeling more hopeful than he had in months. For the first time since this whole situation had started, he felt like he had some control over what happened next. He wasn't just a victim waiting for someone else to fix his problem. He was someone who could make choices about his own life. Over the next few weeks, David began networking with other companies in his field. He updated his resume and started applying for jobs. He discovered that his skills were in high demand, and several companies were interested in interviewing him. The process of looking for a new job reminded him of his own value and capabilities, things he had started to doubt during the months of dealing with Victoria's behavior. 3 months later, David accepted a position with a competing firm. The new job came with a significant salary increase, better benefits, and most importantly, a professional environment where he felt respected and valued. His new colleagues treated him as an equal, and his supervisor communicated with him in a way that was always appropriate and professional. On his last day at the old company, David had an exit interview with Patricia from HR. This time, he was prepared. He presented her with a detailed, written account of everything that had happened with Victoria, including dates, times, and witnesses. He was calm and professional, and he made it clear that he wasn't looking for revenge or compensation. He simply wanted to ensure that his experience was on record, in case future employees faced similar situations. Patricia seemed surprised by the thoroughness of David's documentation. She accepted his written statement and assured him that it would be kept in his file. David left the building that day knowing that he had done everything he could to protect other employees who might find themselves in similar situations. 6 months later, David learned through a former colleague that Victoria had been quietly transferred to a different division of the company. Apparently, David's complaint had not been the only one. Other employees had come forward with similar experiences, and the company had finally been forced to take action. David never regretted his decision to leave. His new job turned out to be everything he had hoped for and more. He was promoted twice in his first year, and he found himself working on projects that challenged him and helped him grow professionally. Most importantly, he went to work every day feeling confident and respected. Looking back, David realized that his experience with Victoria had taught him important lessons about standing up for himself and taking control of his own life. He learned that sometimes the system isn't designed to protect you, and that sometimes the best solution is to create your own path forward. His story became one of empowerment, rather than victimization, a reminder that even in difficult situations, people have the power to make choices that can change their lives for the better.